The emphasis on property has always been a bias that should have reflected serious questions on the Beatles. There's nothing to the idea that I was conscious in any way of having even been brought to their attention. When Martha Gellhorn wrote to me, you might find it strange to emphasize a letter like that, which came to me in Montana from Belize, in light of the fact that what it contained led to no better than a cat's game. And in light of the fact that I divested of my correspondence with Peter Gabriel because I didn't want to be implicated in his misreading of what happened. And she did do a better job, but my point is that I have no idea whether she even spoke to anyone else about what we discussed. It could have been just between me and her, for all I know. But that was a wrong-headed assumption. When I was being cased by Yoko Ono, I had no reason to believe, nor did it cross my mind, that she would be interested in a strip search of me for some reason. And it was, after all, the Beatles who came hollering that I had it all wrong because someone as serious as Gellhorn had addressed me, someone who it was widely whispered should never be taken seriously. Nobody takes you seriously, is what Mike Exler said to me bluntly. So the fact that Martha clearly took me seriously caused some anger and headache among the people who thought it was going to be a breeze to just pull off what they had pulled on Mount Desert Island. Now, of course, I am telling the truth about what I heard and how hard it was to get substantiation for what these people were doing. And Martha was, of course, telling the truth when she was abhorred at the idea that that could be the case. It almost comes over in reflection like an argument with herself. She was admitting she believed me, but she didn't want to. I have no way of knowing whether my reading of all of that is right or wrong. Sticking straight from the text, it's clear that she had the courage to try to understand what I was saying and why I would be saying what I was saying. At that time in the 90s, when the Berlin Wall came down, or the late 80s, I guess it was 1989, I didn't have as much evidence for what happened as I do now. And so the bitterness and anger of the people who didn't like her addressing these issues with me still could avoid being called a cat's game because they simply said that they won, that I lost, that they proved that I was just occupied by my condition as a rejected lover. The letter from Martha Gellhorn led me to do a painting that someone called an abstract expressionist painting. And the reason was because one of the commentators who I follow about Gaza reminded me of what a last stand Martha mounted against her own belief system about Israel. She ended up committing suicide in 1998. In the middle of February. I remember my mother shushing me at the dinner table and looking sort of thunderstruck. And when she was ready to tell me why, she said, "That was about your friend, the woman who wrote to you from Belize." She had just heard an account of who Martha Gellhorn was. She had never really understood how serious it was. You might think, well, is that my way of admitting that I was unworthy of the honor of hearing from her? Yes and no. I mean, Churchill had some very good stories. He talked about one of her friends who I've long been interested in. But he also had a story of a just homeless guy who claimed that he knew something about German anti-radar. And Churchill said, give him the sounding board, let him tell us what he thinks he knows. And Britain cracked the German military secret by keeping an open mind. I'm not saying the British kept an open mind when it came to what I was telling them. They didn't. Martha Gellhorn was trying not to accept what I told her, but she obviously took it very seriously, which is right and proper. I mean, not only did I get the truth, but I got corroboration for it. I should be believed. So I don't think it's a case in point about either way. I mean, I tend to think that probably the most accurate reading of the situation is that I'm a victim of circumstances. There's a certain push in what happened to me that made it difficult for me to ignore what was being stage managed, you might say, about my condition as a deaf library clerk. Very lonely and injured from a travesty. It is possible that someone at the University of Pittsburgh or Peter Gabriel's Real Worlds confided in Martha the letter with the names Ronnie and Casper, tracing to 1974. Again, I had not yet made the association between Reagan and Weinberger and those two people who battered me as a child. They had the same names and they were a partnership. But I hadn't seen that. The older administrators in Posvar's office at Harper's Magazine and Peter Gabriel's Real Worlds had seen it. And it's possible she knew that, which makes it all the more of a cat's game, because you would wonder how anyone could put together a name representation that way, that they were after all calling the walrus, I am he as you are he. In 1973. And of course, the alibi system is that somebody used their names in a forgery. The only people who could be considered suspects in that are from the Shapiro administration of governorship, who were in office then, calling themselves Shap, so people didn't know they were Jewish. Tav and so on, who appears mysteriously at my father's bedside. And you would think that I would jump for joy that there was a life preserver being tossed to me, because they tortured me for questioning whether or not Pentagon, Disney, and Hollywood Magic were behind this mystery, which would implicate Henry Mancini, Paul McCartney, Ronald Reagan, and in the end, John Lennon himself, who appears to have worked this as a Houdini from the age of Italian futurists idea, when Mussolini met D.W. Griffith, about staging a false reality and insisting that people believe it is real or be condemned as traitors, which isn't a cat's game at all, unless you consider tying your own tongue a cat's game. So Martha invited me to tell her exactly what I was saying. Was I saying that Reagan started AIDS, that his administration had been very clearly implicated? I don't think there is any doubt. Martha was a good example of how Hollywood operated. Ingrid Bergman played her in For Whom the Bell Tolls. Ingrid Bergman was a Swede who came from Nazi German cinema. You can say that I have a confirmatory bias, but at the time I was trying to not believe what had happened too. So I don't think that there is a confirmatory bias in evaluating, for example, a comparison of The Killers with the Zapruder film. Two films made in fall of 1963, one starring Reagan, one starring JFK, one a victim of a crime, and one about the perpetuation of a crime. I know that there's a lot of hope that the way that I was humiliated as a liberal can somehow continue to convince people who are aware that this spectacle is very revealing about what went on, that people like me deserved it. There is a lot of that sort of attitude in current affairs. My views were formed as a child being pushed around by the 60s crowd and manipulated by U.S. Army thugs who had access to me because my father had divorced us and abandoned me because I was alone in the public schools of Pittsburgh. And because the administrative dimension was so heavily organized as a participant in the plans for the crime. And because there's always remorse and questioning when it comes to human romance. Supposedly the fall from grace was represented by sin. You know, when they talk about my distinguished grandparents who were 66 years old, they think, well, wouldn't you like to hear how the elderly in Topeka feel about your cravings for beautiful girls? So I become a sort of flesh and blood effigy of JFK's philandering. by witnessing and looking into what's going on in these rings of the libido. And I didn't like what was happening. I don't believe there's anything in Martha's letter that suggests that she wasn't dumbfounded too, by that something like that could be supported or perpetuated. So there's a great division in which Martha and I, no matter what she believed, no matter how she responded, whether appropriately or in a way that was hamstrung, are still on the same side, which is that we would never countenance such an act.